The Uyghur Tribunal, it looks official, it sounds official, but it's not. It's not even really fair to call it a tribunal. It would be more accurate to call it theater. Why is that? Let's just look at the Uyghur Tribunal's official website and start there. So when you go to their homepage, it says UK Tribunal to investigate China's alleged genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghur, Kazakh, and other Turkic Muslim populations. When you read UK Tribunal, it sounds like the UK organized this. In fact, it's just being held in the UK. That's it. Has no official affiliation with the British government. So right there, you already see them trying to inflate the illusion of legitimacy around this so-called tribunal. Now, if you go to the About page right here, they say in June 2020, Dolkan Issa, president of the World Uyghur Congress, formally requested that Sir Geoffrey Nice establish and chair an independent people's tribunal to investigate ongoing atrocities and possible genocide against the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic Muslim populations. And they say that it was launched on September 2020 with assistance from a non-governmental organization, the Coalition for Genocide Response. And we'll get into who they are in just a moment, but who's funding all of this? So it says, help us fund the second hearing of the Uyghur Tribunal. And so down here, it admits that the initial amount of around $115,000 donated by the Uyghur diaspora through the World Uyghur Congress. Now, I don't believe that. I believe the World Uyghur Congress had a budget and they spent it on the Uyghur Tribunal. It's pretty obvious. They initiated it, they organized it, they're funding it, they're saying the money came through them. Let's find out what money the World Uyghur Congress has coming into it. This is the National Endowment for Democracy. It was created by the US government. It is funded annually by the US government. It is overseen by Congress and the US State Department. And what they do is they fund political interference of regime change operations all around the globe, including in China. And their operations in China are so extensive, they have to break them down into regions. So this is the Xinjiang/East Turkestan region. And East Turkestan, in case you don't know, is the word that separatists and terrorists call Xinjiang, China. The international community recognizes Xinjiang as part of China. They do not recognize this East Turkestan. And so who's the US government funding through the NED? Many organizations, including World Uyghur Congress. So when World Uyghur Congress says the money came through them to fund this tribunal, they're talking about US government money. Now, let's look at the Coalition for Genocide Response. Let's look at the team and let's notice that this NGO that helped launch the Uyghur Tribunal, let's notice that the guy who's also chairing the tribunal is part of this coalition. So you could see that these are all just mechanisms that the US government funds to do things like this, to put on theater productions like the Uyghur Tribunal. And before the Uyghur Tribunal was something called the China Tribunal, and it was initiated by the End Transplant Abuse in China, or ETAC. And so you see ETAC listed here as part of this coalition that helped launch the Uyghur Tribunal. Here's the China Tribunal, and right down here, it was initiated by the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, ETAC. Right there is Geoffrey Nice, so you keep seeing his face, and you keep seeing these US government-funded fronts involved in drumming up these so-called tribunals. If you look at ETAC and their International Advisory Committee, and you just go through who any of these people are, you'll see people like Louisa Grieve. She worked at the National Endowment for Democracy for over 20 years, and now she works for NED-funded Uyghur Human Rights Project, which is also listed here on the NED's official website. It's the first one right up here. So that's her, and then right beneath her is Ethan Gutman. He's supposedly an investigative journalist, and he wrote this book called The Slaughter about this organ harvesting, that this was what they were going with before Uyghur genocide. So where did he launch his book? The launching of The Slaughter will be today, August 12th, at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. This was years ago, but it just goes to show you who these people are all associated with, who they're working with. They're all working together to make these tribunals. Let's look at how the Western media is reporting this. China slams second session of Uyghur Tribunal investigating Xinjiang human rights abuses. From Radio Free Asia. This is US State Department funded media. And they're saying the panel, which has no state backing, aims to galvanize international action to hold China accountable for alleged maltreatment of the minority group. What does this mean, no state backing? What does that mean? Does that mean no legal backing by any state? Because that's true. There is no legal framework or basis or anything. The tribunal is purely for show, but it definitely has state financial backing. The US government is funding this through the World Uyghur Congress. We've just proven that. It says, though the London panel has no state backing and any judgment will be non-binding on any government, it aims to galvanize international action to hold China accountable for the abuse. And what that means is the US funded this. They're pretending that it's independent and impartial. And when they come to their politically motivated conclusion, the US will use that conclusion to pressure countries around the globe to probably boycott the 2022 Olympics in Beijing, and also pressure countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative to kind of roll back their ties with China based on this and all of the other things they've got going at the same time. Now, they bring up the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and they're saying that they accused it of being a kangaroo court and having nothing to do with the law. And they admitted themselves in this article that it has nothing to do with the law, has no basis in any sort of legal process. And then they said that it was funded mostly by the World Uyghur Congress. That's true. They admitted it on the Uyghur Tribunal's official website that the money came through the World Uyghur Congress. China accuses the World Uyghur Congress of being an organization dedicated to separating Xinjiang from China. And they put it in quotation marks like that's just what China says and that it's probably not true. And then Radio Free Asia, they've put in the World Uyghur Congress is an international organization based in Germany that represents the collective interests of Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and abroad. But that's not true, because you will never see World Uyghur Congress refer to Xinjiang as Xinjiang. I will prove that to you. This is World Uyghur Congress's official website, who we are, mission statement. The World Uyghur Congress declares a nonviolent and peaceful opposition movement against Chinese occupation of East Turkestan. So they see Xinjiang, China as East Turkestan and being occupied by China. They are a separatist movement and they are funded by the US government. And if you go to Uyghur Human Rights Project, here's their website. There's Louise Grieve. And actually, there's Elsie Anderson. She actually did a statement at the Uyghur Tribunal. We'll get into that in just a moment, but let's go to About. Uyghur Human Rights Project says that they promote the rights of the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim peoples in East Turkestan, referred to by the Chinese government as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So do you see what's going on here? The US government is funding separatism, including violent separatism, inside of China, in Xinjiang. They are funding these organizations that are openly separatist. They refer to Xinjiang as East Turkestan. Even the UN, the United Nations Security Council, listing the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, as a terrorist organization. They note that it is an organization which has used violence to further its aim of setting up an independent, so-called East Turkestan within China, and it's in quotation marks because it is not real, it does not exist, it is Xinjiang, it is in China. This terrorist organization is seeking to carve it off from China in violation of the UN Charter, and the US is helping them and organizations like the World Uyghur Congress and the Uyghur Human Rights Project and many more to do this. The Uyghur Tribunal, it is just a giant production, a very large, elaborate production. And it is really just a larger version of something like this. So I just want to give you a very simple example to show you what the US government is doing and how they are working through fake fronts like the World Uyghur Congress. This is from Reuters. This is September 2021. China accuses Washington of low political tricks over Uyghur exhibit. Now look at this. That's the U.S. State Department's official seal in partnership with the U.S. mission. Okay, and who's this guy? They're going to tell you. Dokkan Issa, the guy who initiated the Uyghur Tribunal. He's the president of the World Uyghur Congress. He gives the final touches for a United States-backed Uyghur photo exhibit of dozens of people who are missing or alleged to be held in Chinese-run camps in Xinjiang, China, in front of the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, September 16, 2021. So that's what the Uyghur Tribunal is. It's just a giant, elaborate version of this. That's all it is. And now, not only is the World Uyghur Congress, not only did they initiate it, not only did they fund it, but they have members of their organization. This is the UK project director of the World Uyghur Congress. They're supporting the tribunal by interpreting and translating the witness testimonies. Okay, so this is a Voice of America article, Beijing blasts tribunal investigating human rights in Xinjiang. Now, one more thing I want to point out is I showed you these organizations that are being funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. They include the Uyghur Human Rights Project, World Uyghur Congress, and down here, this one will be important for later, Campaign for Uyghurs. But then there's another one listed on this other page. This is NED, Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, builds on work of NED grantees. And if you come down here, they list all the ones that I just mentioned, plus this one, the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database Project. Okay, so all of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, all 4 of them were involved in the so-called Uyghur Tribunal. So it's not just some casual association with the US government. All of these US government-funded fronts were involved in the Uyghur Tribunal. Now, I was talking about the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, and I think it's important before we get into the details of the tribunal itself to give some background on what was going on in Xinjiang before China enacted these security measures that the US is claiming is genocide, which it most certainly isn't. There was very real terrorism taking place in Xinjiang. It was going on for many years before China finally decided to take the measures that it did. So they really waited a long time, some people might say too long, to address this problem. And as you're going to see here, it is a huge problem. So what I'm showing you here right now are these attacks that took place over the years. And these are vicious terrorist attacks. These are people who were radicalized both inside China and outside of China. And they were carrying out attacks where they were killing not just, police and soldiers, but also just ordinary people, and not just Han Chinese, but also other Uyghurs. And they were walking up to people they didn't know, people who did them no wrong, who were just going about their daily business, and they were hacking them to pieces with machetes and swords and knives. They were slashing their throats out in front of their family members, out in public, at markets, in train stations. And this was what was going on for years inside China, not just in Xinjiang, but all over China. This attack in Kunming, this was the rail station in Kunming. They're just slaughtering these people like animals in front of their family members. These are people that are just traveling. They have nothing to do with the government. If you want to claim that this was a reaction to Beijing's policies, why are these terrorists attacking ordinary people who had nothing to do with that? And so this was what was going on. And we hear all the time about genocide in Xinjiang. And then when you say, where are the bodies? They admit, okay, it's not a genocide. It's a cultural genocide. But I'm going to show you that it wasn't that either. The real cultural genocide happened when US ally Saudi Arabia was exporting its politically tinged perversion of Islam, Salafism. This is a Los Angeles Times article. This is from 2016 in China. Rise of Salafism fosters suspicion and division among Muslims. And they were talking about how this radicalized, politically motivated perversion of Islam was turning people against each other in their own communities. So this wasn't Uyghurs against Han. This was Uyghurs against Uyghurs. and they were radicalizing them, and they would no longer accept traditions that had been in place among Muslim Uyghurs for generations. So this was the real cultural genocide that was taking place. And it's not a coincidence that the US and Saudi Arabia had done this in other places like Afghanistan against the Soviets, and more recently in Iraq and Syria against the governments there. They were also doing it in Xinjiang. And if you read through this article, it's very clear that that's what they were doing. So they say here, Saudi preachers and organizations began traveling to China. Some of them bore gifts, training programs for clerics, Qurans for distribution, funding for new Islamic institutes and mosques. And this was part of what was radicalizing these separatists. It had nothing to do with traditional Muslims in Xinjiang chafing at constraints Beijing was placing on them. It was because of this. It was because of what the US was doing in Central Asia and also doing to Xinjiang. And if you're in doubt about how far back US armed subversion in China goes, look at the US State Department's official Office of the Historian. This is a memo from 1964, and they're talking about Tibetan operations and paramilitary activity that the CIA was funding in and along China's borders. So they were arming these Tibetan militants. They were arming Uyghurs and helping radicalize them and using their allies to help radicalize them, just like they're doing in Syria. So this is what was going on in Xinjiang in the lead up to this security crackdown, to the creation of these vocational centers to try to deprogram these people. Look at this violence. These are people walking up to complete strangers who did them no wrong in any shape, form, or way. Some of them are Uyghurs that they're attacking. And they're just walking up to them and sawing at their throats with knives or blowing themselves up with bombs. These people are mentally ill. They have been radicalized. They are out of their minds. And so what do you do with people like this who are a danger to themselves and to others, especially if there's warning signs? Warning signs that can warn people that they're on this path and that they are a threat to themselves and to society. And you know, in the West, and this is a US government health website. This is the National Center for Biotechnology Information, US National Library of Medicine, and they're talking about involuntary commitment. And they're talking about how people who are mentally ill, who cannot make decisions on their own, and who are a danger to themselves and to others, they can be committed by the state, civil commitment. You don't wait for them to carry out an attack and mass murder people. When you see the warning signs, you can treat them. You don't just throw them in prison and punish them. You bring them someplace where they can be deprogrammed. This is not cultural genocide. This is undoing the cultural genocide that the US and its partners in Saudi Arabia and also Turkey were doing to Xinjiang. Radicalizing these people, encouraging separatism, encouraging violent separatism. This is what these facilities were doing. They were deprogramming them so they could rejoin society in a constructive manner. And if you look at these older articles from the West, why China's Uyghurs are joining jihadists in Afghanistan. This one from the Wall Street Journal. Webb preaches jihad to China's Muslim Uyghurs. China says internet, social media incite terrorism among Uyghur minority, because a lot of this was happening from beyond China's borders. There were groups of people outside of China trying to radicalize people inside of China. And here's a BBC article I like to tell people about all the time. Why is there tension between China and the Uyghurs? And it's from 2014. And let's scroll down. There is this list of terrorist attacks that the BBC writes about here that they never talk about anymore. Now all they talk about is China cracking down on the Uyghurs, as if China just woke up one day and decided to torment Uyghurs for no reason other than the fact that they're Uyghurs. But here's the BBC admitting to all of the murder and mayhem that was taking place in Xinjiang and beyond. So it says, China has been accused of intensifying its crackdown on Uyghurs after street protests in the 1990s, and again in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Now it's funny that they've got this Uyghur Tribunal in the lead up to the 2022 Beijing Olympics. Really interesting. But things really escalated in 2009 with large-scale ethnic rioting in the regional capital, Urumqi. Some 200 people were killed in the unrest, most of them Han Chinese, according to officials. Security was increased and many Uyghurs detained as suspects, but violence rumbled on as right groups increasingly pointed to tight control by Beijing. Yes, the more murder and mayhem that takes place, the more control a government needs to implement to stop it. In June 2012, 6 Uyghurs reportedly tried to hijack a plane from Hotan to Urumqi before they were overpowered by passengers and crew. There was bloodshed in April 2013, and in June that year, 27 people died in Xinjiang County after police opened fire on what state media described as a mob armed with knives attacking local government buildings. Establishing facts about these incidents is difficult because foreign journalists' access to the region is tightly controlled, but in recent months there appears to have been a shift towards larger-scale incidents where citizens have become the target, particularly in Xinjiang. At least 31 people were killed and more than 90 suffered injuries in May 2014 when 2 cars crashed through an Urumqi market and explosives were tossed into the crowd. China called it a violent terrorist incident, and they put it in quotation marks as if it wasn't a violent terrorist incident. And you saw the footage. You saw that it was very obviously a terrorist attack. It followed a bomb and knife attack in Urumqi's South Railway Station in April, which killed 3 and injured 79 others. In July, authorities said a knife-wielding gang attacked the police station and government offices in Yarkand, leaving 96 dead. The imam of China's largest mosque, Jume Tahir, was stabbed to death days later. In September, about 50 died in blasts in Luntai County outside police stations, a market, and a shop. Details of both incidents are unclear, and activists have contested some accounts of incidents in state media. Yes, activists who we know are separatists, who support the separatist movement, they're going to contest it, and then we can contest them contesting those accounts. Some violence has also spilled out of Xinjiang. A March stabbing spree in Kunming in Yunnan province that killed 29 people was blamed on Xinjiang separatists, as was an October 2013 incident where a car plowed into a crowd and burst into flames in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. You saw the footage of that. That was also very obviously a terrorist attack. It wasn't a car accident that Beijing was just calling a terrorist attack. In response to the latest slew of attacks, the authorities have launched what they call a year-long campaign against terrorism, stepping up security in Xinjiang and conducting more military drills in the region. So back then, the BBC was more than happy to showcase how out of control Xinjiang was and how helpless Beijing was to get it under control. A year after this article was published, Uyghur separatists detonated a bomb in downtown Bangkok. They killed 20 people. So this was violence that was spreading out, not only across China, but across Asia, and then thousands of these Uyghur extremists were going to Turkey and then entering into Syria to fight alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is what China was up against. This is why they initiated this extensive program to rehabilitate these people. When you have extremism and radicalization on this scale, you need an equally large scale project to de-radicalize them. And then more recently, this was just in late 2020, this is The Guardian, U.S. removes shadowy group from terror list blamed by China for attacks. State Department says no credible evidence the East Turkestan Islamic movement exists. So we were just talking about ETIM, how the UN Security Council says it's a terrorist group. But the U.S. says no, they haven't been active for over a decade. It says right here, ETIM was removed from the list because for more than a decade there has been no credible evidence that ETIM continues to exist. A State Department spokesman said. Yet the very next year, 2021, this was September 2021, ETIM spokespeople gave an interview with Newsweek, a U.S.-based media magazine. So exclusive, despite China's pressure on Taliban, Uyghur separatists see opportunity in Afghanistan. They kind of poke a hole in the US State Department's statement the year before, because it says right here, for many years, the US included ETIM on its terrorist exclusion list. The Pentagon even targeted the group with airstrikes in Afghanistan up until at least 2018. So they delisted them in 2020, saying they haven't been active for a decade, yet they were just attacking them in 2018, just 2 years before they delisted them. So the US is lying. The US is lying about ETIM. They're lying about the situation in Xinjiang. They are deliberately sponsoring terrorist groups, also political groups, pushing for separatism inside of China, in contradiction to the UN Charter, and its provisions on non-interference, non-intervention. And one more thing, because we're going to hear them claiming, well, first of all, they tried to claim that China is just pretending that it's counterterrorism, that really they're just bent on ethnic genocide, which is not true. You see that they obviously had a real terrorist problem. That's what they were reacting to. Even at face value, if we were to believe these claims that there were 1 million Uyghurs locked up in these centers in Xinjiang, let's look at how the US handled terrorism, their war on terror. This is from Brown University. It's not Beijing University, it's Brown University in the United States. Costs of the 20-year war on terror, $8 trillion and 900,000 deaths. Not 1 million locked up, 1 million dead. 1 million dead. And they're talking about the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. And you got to remember that a lot of this had nothing to do with terrorism at all. They just lied and said that it did. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003 had nothing to do with terrorism. They lied about weapons of mass destruction being in Iraq. They invaded and they killed all of those people. They destroyed the country. They did the same thing to Libya and Syria. And even Afghanistan, they claimed they were there to get bin Laden. They had killed bin Laden and they stayed another decade. So obviously, this toll here, $8 trillion and almost 1 million deaths, had nothing to do with terrorism. They were just saying that it did. That's how they were justifying what were actually a series of wars of aggression they waged from North Africa to Central Asia. And then they have the audacity to turn around and say, China, inside your own borders, we don't like the way you're dealing with this terrorism that, by the way, we're sponsoring. So I introduced the Uyghur Tribunal. You see that it was initiated by the World Uyghur Congress. The World Uyghur Congress funds it, and the World Uyghur Congress in turn is funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. And I mentioned there's a group of organizations that participated in this Uyghur Tribunal. If you go to the Uyghur Tribunal official website, you're going to see this page called Statements, and it's all of the written statements given by everyone who went in front of these panels. You can see there's a lot of them. If you go to the Uyghur Tribunal YouTube channel, you'll see that they uploaded all of this talking, and they're almost 10 hours each, and there's 8 of them, so it's about 80 hours of people talking, and no one's going to sit through all of that. But what I did was I spot checked it. I went through it, I spot checked it. I also did research on the background of all of these people who provided statements, and so let's just go through a few of them. So you have Dolkan Issa, who is the president of the World Uyghur Congress, which initiated and funded the tribunal, and then he's sitting there participating in it. And again, the World Uyghur Congress is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and in turn the US government. Here is Sean Robert. He was a senior advisor for the USAID Central Asia programs. So these would be all of the countries bordering the Xinjiang region that were stirring up trouble inside of Xinjiang. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. Sairago Sayap Bey, she got the 2020 Women of Courage Award from the First Lady and then US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. There she is. So that's the US State Department's Women of Courage Award. So she was at the Uyghur Tribunal giving statements. Here's Matir Iwequid, and she is from the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database. She gave a statement, and her organization is funded by the US government through the NED. She also provided a statement that contradicted itself twice. She gave different numbers of Uyghurs interned as part of this security crackdown, and they range from 1 to like 3 million. And the panel even questioned her and said, how come there's this discrepancy? What are your sources? And she couldn't answer the question. They also asked her, why did you say that after a Uyghur woman gives birth to her first child, you say she got a birth control device implanted in her? And yet in this other part of your report, you say in cities, they can have 2 children. In the countryside, they can have 3 children. Why do you have this discrepancy? And she couldn't answer it. And then Jeffrey Nice intervened and said, just come back, straighten out your story and come back. So that's how they deal with stories that don't add up. And also notice she's holding the East Turkestan separatist flag. Just keep note of that. All of these people who are pretending they're impartial human rights advocates fighting for human rights in Xinjiang, it's not true. They're separatists hiding behind the smokescreen of human rights advocacy. Here is Shoret Hossard, and he's an employee of the US government's Radio Free Asia. So he was testifying. Here is Mihrakon Tursan, and she got the US Citizen Power Award, and that's associated with the National Endowment for Democracy. So she might not necessarily work for an NED-funded organization, but she is part of the NED-funded Uyghur separatist ecosystem. Here is Rushan Abbas, and she's part of the Campaign for Uyghurs, and it is funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. She testified as part of the Uyghur Tribunal. Here is Julie Millsap. She is also working for Campaign for Uyghurs, funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. There's Darren Byler. He is a contributor to China File. China File is a subsidiary of Asia Society, which is funded by Open Society Foundation, the Australian government, the Japanese government, and several others. The link will be in the video description below, so you can check out who's funding all of these groups. There's also Jessica Batke, and she's also from China File. So there's hardly any diversity in these sources. They have multiple people from the same organization showing up. And you would think that if there was real genocide taking place in Xinjiang, and it was as massive as we're being told, between 1 to 3 million people being locked away, why is it just the same handful of people that show up over and over again to talk about it? Why aren't there many, many more people coming out and talking about this? And many people coming out and talking about this who are not directly affiliated with the US government. Here's Nathan Ruser from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. This is funded by the US State Department. Here's Adrian Zenz from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. This is funded by the US Congress. So do you see the pattern developing here? Almost all of these people are funded by the US government. Here is Bahram Sintash. He is part of the US government-funded Uyghur Human Rights Project. And he was the guy who claimed a shopping mall that was demolished, including a thing that looked like a minaret, but it was actually a 360-degree cafe. He said that that was part of Beijing's campaign of cultural genocide, when it was clearly just redevelopment. Here's Elsie Anderson. I talked about her with Uyghur Human Rights Project. Here is Laura Harth, Safeguard Defenders. This used to be called China Action, and then they rebranded. It's all the same people, and China Action was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. They got caught, and I think some of them got detained in China and then kicked out, and then they rebranded as Safeguard Defenders. And now they're very careful not to mention any defunding on their website. And so there you have it. That's some of the people who took part, but not all of them. There's many other people in there. I took about a whole day researching this, and that's what I could come up with in just a day. Now I want to talk about some of these testimonies and the glaring inconsistencies. I talked about a few of them, but I want to show you a few more. So there's this one from Gulsiri Alakwankizi. And she claims that she was interned and she was tortured and abused, and then she was forced to labor in this factory. And then this is her written statement down here. They told me to sign a contract where I agreed to work at this factory for a year. I ended up working there for a month and a half, so 45 days, let's say. I earned very little. In total, I made more than 2,000 gloves and earned 220 yuan. And then she says, one good thing was that I now had my phone back. So after a year, I could talk to my husband. One day, I took a picture of the factory and sent it to him. From there, it became public. Following this, I was interrogated. They asked the same questions they had always asked all night long, but eventually they let me go. Now, take that written statement and compare it to her spoken statement.
So the order would be to make 20 gloves a day, and I wouldn't deliver. I would make maybe 11 a day, sometimes 12, but I wouldn't always complete the 20 pairs a day thing. And they said it's 10, well, she calls it kopecks, but I guess like 10 cents a pair or something like that. And they also told us that these gloves are exported to Americas or to European countries. Also, when they transferred me to the factory where we were producing the gloves, I sent a photo, and actually as a punishment for sending that photo, they put me in an isolation, let's say like it's a ditch, like a 20 meters deep well. So they throw some electric currents at me, they pour water at me, and they kept me there for 24 hours as well.
She says there was a 20 glove quota, but she could only make 10 or 12 a day. So 10 or 12 gloves a day doesn't even come close to the 2,000 she claims she made in her written statement. Even if you try to give her benefit of the doubt and say, maybe she meant pairs of gloves and then individual gloves. If you try working the math that way, it still doesn't add up. If you try to work the math where maybe they translated month to year, it doesn't add up that way either. So it just seems like her story is inconsistent. Either she's lying or she cannot remember what happened. And then the story about her being interrogated all night because she sent that photo to her husband. In her spoken statement, she says that she was thrown into a ditch and had water poured on her and she was electrocuted, and that it went on for 24 hours. So how did she go from this written statement where she was interrogated all night and then let go to this story of torture and abuse for 24 hours? Again, it's an inconsistency, and it's an inconsistency the panel never addressed. They never said, hey, how come your spoken statement contradicts your written statement? Why? And here's the thing. I'm not going to assume that she's just a liar. Maybe she just can't remember. But this is the problem with witness accounts. And when you only have witness accounts to go by, and people who are involved in these foreign-funded organizations that politically gain from smearing and accusing China of these things, this is the problem with depending solely on witness accounts. A witness account is a good starting point where you hear these accusations and then you investigate them and you find the physical evidence. They're claiming that 1 million or 3 million people are being interned and there's some kind of genocide going on, and yet the only thing they can do is parade the same handful of witnesses around telling these flawed stories that you can see with your own eyes don't add up. There was another woman, Tursane Ziawadan, and she says that she was in Kazakhstan with her husband from 2011 to 2016. So that's about 5 years. And then she returned to China and she was arrested. And she claims, and she kind of infers, that when she was being interrogated, they were asking her about the World Uyghur Congress. And she says, we don't have access to this information in China. But this claim directly contradicts her whole story. She claims that she was in Kazakhstan for 5 years. She wasn't just in China. So she didn't have access to that information in China, but she surely had it in Kazakhstan. So this is a lie. She's lying. She doesn't explain why she was lying. Maybe she was just lying to the guard because she was involved with the World Uyghur Congress. She didn't want the guard to know. I'm not going to assume that I know, but again, this was another inconsistency that the panel didn't point out at all. They didn't ask any questions about it. They didn't try to clarify it. They were just taking in all of these statements, and the Western media was just cherry-picking what sounded worse to paint China in the worst light possible and pushing that out in articles. And here is Arslan Hidayet. He was an interpreter for at least 2 of the witnesses in Turkey. And they never mention that Arslan is one of these people who advocates ethnically cleansing Xinjiang of Han Chinese and other people who are not ethnic Uyghurs. And so this is a conversation that he had with Daniel Dumbrell, where he was talking about, there's nothing wrong with this video. He is warning the people of China who have illegally settled occupied East Turkestan to leave or face the consequences. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is Uyghurs currently don't have the capacity to physically defend or take back their land. So whilst I support the message, we are a long way away from doing so. Freedom-loving nations should be funding Uyghurs militarily to turn the message in the video into reality. The CCP, along with every single occupier, have to leave East Turkestan. That sounds like ethnic cleansing to me. And then when asked what he means by all these people needing to leave, he says they will be made to leave with force if necessary if they are not native to that land. So every aspect of this Uyghur tribunal was put together by US-funded separatists, not merely people interested in human rights in Xinjiang. These are people who advocate separatism, who want to carve off Xinjiang and transform it into East Turkestan. These are people who have advocated violent ethnic cleansing of Xinjiang. So they're accusing China of this, and they have spent years claiming this and have produced no evidence of this, and yet they, with their own mouths, are saying they are going to do the exact same thing. Kind of makes you wonder why China had this security crackdown in the first place. You can see that these are the sort of people who were fueling that violence we saw in all that video footage that the BBC admits in its own article was taking place in China. The US no sooner gets done pulling out of Afghanistan and the world watching what they did there collapse in on itself, the US stabbing its allies in the back and leaving the country a wreck. And they're going headfirst into this propaganda war with China to do the exact same thing. They have a couple of goals here. One, they're obviously timing this to coincide with the Beijing 2022 Olympics, so they're going to definitely try to ruin that. They're also trying to build a case for more sanctions against China. China is going to surpass the US economically, so if that's the case, the US wants to hurt them economically. Doing that requires sanctions, among other tools, and in order to get sanctions in place, you have to convince the world that China is horrible. And so that is another goal of the Uyghur Tribunal. This is also about adding pressure to Belt and Road Initiative partners. There's a constant campaign to convince countries working with China to roll back their ties. So this will be another excuse they can put on the list to try to shame countries into cutting their ties with China. And finally, this is all about war propaganda. The US would love to wage a short, limited, conventional conflict off China's coasts, destroy maritime shipping, destroy China's trade, and knock China down a peg economically so that America can hang on to primacy in the Indo-Pacific region for years, maybe decades more to come. In order to do that, they need to stir the public up. And the only way they could do that is by making China look as bad as possible. Accusing them of genocide is part of doing that. I thought it was really important to go in depth regarding the Uyghur Tribunal. It would have been easy for me to just show you that the World Uyghur Congress initiated it, funded it, and had their president speaking at the tribunal to give you an idea of just how illegitimate it all was. But I thought it was important to kind of go into a little bit more detail about the situation in Xinjiang before the security crackdown, why these people had to be interned, and the fact that the people who have this huge chip on their shoulder against China are demonstrably separatists. They're not just merely people concerned about human rights in Xinjiang. They are people who want to carve Xinjiang off of China and establish it as East Turkestan. These are all things that no other nation on earth would tolerate. Neither does China. They have a right to defend themselves against this sort of interference and intervention. When this fake tribunal gives its final ruling, you're going to know everything behind this whole stunt. And you're also going to be armed with the knowledge needed to see through the next one that they organize, because this is the Uyghur Tribunal is the second of two tribunals that this same circle of US funded interests has orchestrated. They had the China Tribunal, now the Uyghur Tribunal, surely there will be another one. Now you'll be able to see through it. Now you know all of the names and organizations involved. It'll be very easy to punch through the lies next time. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. I have a website, newatlas.report. All of my articles and videos are there. I don't have any sort of presence on social media, so if you want to follow my work, go there. If I ever get kicked off of YouTube, I will still be able to host videos on my website from other video sharing platforms. So please bookmark it, share it with others, check it out. There is no paywall, and there never will be. Check the video's description for the link to the article about this video. There were way too many sources to put in the video description. So they were all put into an article. Go to that article, look through all of the sources. If you ever need to know anything about the US Uyghur human rights racket, go to that reference list. It's all there. Also in the video description are ways that you can help support my work. To everyone who is supporting my work, whether it's through Patreon month to month, single donations, or just sharing my work, liking and sharing my work, that all helps. I could not do this without that support. Thank you so much, and as always, thank you for watching.